The ancient city-states of Greece faced many problems shared with modern society. One of these was the limited availability of resources. The city-states all developed on agricultural economies. Agriculture requires land, and there were limited opportunities for expansion, beyond war and conquest. Successful conquest brought with it additional mouths to feed. It became apparent to philosophical and political leaders that limiting the growth of the population to what could be comfortably supported by the available resources was an obligation of the state. Both Plato and Aristotle argued the state's duty to ensure the success of society by controlling the growth of the population. Up to 2,000 ancient city-states existed at different times in ancient Greece, most of them long forgotten by all but the most devoted scholars of the ancient world. Several formed into leagues, which preceded the most well-known of the city-states today. Many of them warred with each other, and with Macedon and Rome. Nearly all of them practiced some form of population control. Here are some of the ways the city-states of ancient Greece and the Roman Republic and Empire practiced population control to ensure their longevity and the welfare of their citizens. Number 1. Ancient Greece was not as democratic as most believe. It was widely believed, and rightly so, that Athens gave democratic government to posterity. It was the world's first known democratic form of government, but it was a limited democracy. The poorest citizens of Athens were not allowed to participate, nor were slaves or former slaves. Slavery was rife in Athens, as it was in all of the Greek city-states, and slaves were owned by both individuals and by the state itself. Slaves were not allowed to marry without permission of their owner, nor were they allowed to have children, unless they received permission. Controlling the behavior of slaves was a form of population control practiced by the state. Both the state and individual owners could grant their slaves their freedom, and often manumission was promised to provide incentive for harder work. The freed slaves were not granted a path to citizenship, and former slaves were not allowed to participate in the democratic process. Former slaves remained non-citizens, and relocation to another city did not alter their status. Following the development of democracy in Athens, several other Greek city-states adopted similar governments and policies towards non-citizens, all of them restricting certain liberties among the lowest classes of society. Number 2. Prostitutes were believed to be essential for population control. There is a reason that prostitution is referred to as the world's oldest profession. Prostitutes are described in both testaments of the Bible, in the ancient texts of China and India, and in virtually all records of the ancient world. The Greek city-states did not make the practice illegal, rather it was a licensed profession, regulated and taxed by the government. At the same time, the crime of rape was punishable by death, and a man who engaged in an affair with a married woman could be legally killed by the offended husband, if he had the opportunity to catch them in the act. Prostitutes were both male and female, though their clientele was overwhelmingly male. The women engaged in the profession practiced birth control, using various herbs and other methods to prevent pregnancy and abortion to end it. As in all aspects of life in the ancient Greek city-states, prostitutes were divided by class and treated accordingly. An Athenian politician, Solon, was deemed the first to place prostitutes in brothels, a measure he undertook to curb both sexually transmitted diseases and unwanted pregnancies. The establishment of brothels in Athens was recognized as a part of Athenian democracy, and members of all social classes were welcome to use them, without fear of being labeled immoral by their fellow citizens. Number 3. Both citizens and non-citizens were permitted to own prostitutes. The lowest level on the social scale for prostitutes was men and women owned by pornobaskos or pimps. The pimps were male or female, citizen or non-citizen, medics, who collected a percentage of the fees earned. In turn, they paid the state. The prostitutes, pornai, at this level were considered to be slaves, and were accorded the same protections the state provided to all slaves. In Athens it was illegal for an owner to beat slaves, or otherwise abuse them. Daughters of citizens renounced or abandoned by their fathers could be made slaves, after being adopted by the state and forced into one of the state-sanctioned brothels, which flourished in varying areas of the cities. At a level above the pornai were streetwalkers, who were not owned by a pimp or the state, and selected their own clientele. Pornai who had been able to buy their freedom often continued to work as prostitutes independently. They typically charged more than those found in brothels, and some became quite wealthy. It is known from Aristotle that musicians who provided entertainment at banquets and feasts were also hired for their services in sexual entertainment, negotiated as part of their overall, shall we say, performance. Prostitution was sanctioned and supported as a means of supporting population control, and was widely practiced in the city-states. Number 4. The Greeks used abortion as a means of population control. Socrates reported that the midwives of Athens, he was the son of a midwife himself, resorted to several means to bring unwanted pregnancies to a premature end. The physicians of ancient Greece were aware of the surgical procedures for abortions. Though they hesitated to perform them, their concerns were over the risk to the mother, which were the same risks afforded by all forms of invasive surgery, shock, blood loss, and infections. Among them, prostitutes were more likely to consult physicians for abortions than were married women, or unmarried women who became pregnant. Abortions were legal throughout ancient Greece. Other methods than surgical abortions were reported by Socrates. Midwives provided drugs combined with various chants and charms which induced abortions. Potions derived from herbs and combinations of herbs were used for the same purpose. Among the herbs resorted to by the midwives were birthwort, roots and berries from juniper, myrrh, pennyroyal and others, which were administered mixed with wine. Pennyroyal was also taken as a contraceptive, in the belief that it was effective in preventing pregnancy. None of the contraceptive practices nor abortions bore a social stigma in all levels of Greek society. Number 5. The ceremony of Amphidromia marked a change in the status of an infant. In Athens, a feast was held 5 to 7 days following the birth of a child, at which time the infant was bestowed its name. Wealthier families held the ceremony on the 10th day following birth. The infant was presented to its family and the event celebrated its welcome. The home was adorned with olive branches for a male child, while females were signified with decorations of wool. The timing was based on the belief that children who were born sickly would die before a week or so passed. Once the event was completed, the child obtained the protections offered by the state. The protections were in accordance with the class status of the family. The child's name was bestowed by its father. Before that transpired, the father could, without fear of legal retribution, abandon the infant by placing it outside the home. Most Greek city-states had specific locations where the child was to be abandoned. Thus, unwanted children could be simply disposed of. A legal form of infanticide. Once the child was abandoned, regardless of the reasons for the parent rejecting it, it was doomed to either death or, if lucky, adoption. Most died. Abandoned infants were a common theme in ancient literature and included Oedipus, Romulus and Remus, and Moses. Number 6. The rejection of deformed infants was a form of population control not limited to Sparta. Sparta became well known for its removal of infants born with deformity of limbs, blindness, or other signs of weakness. According to Plutarch, Spartan infants were presented to city elders for inspection. A healthy and well-formed infant was given back to the father, along with orders to rear the child in accordance with Spartan morals and law. If it was ill-born and deformed, they sent it to the so-called apothoti, a chasm-like place at the foot of Mount Taygetus. To the Spartans, such children offered little to the state in return for the expense and trouble of raising them to a presumably unproductive adulthood. Sparta was not the only Greek city-state to endorse the abandonment of children, which were deemed by society to be a potential burden. Aristotle, who endorsed nearly all forms of population control by the state, supported infanticide for all children born with deformities of any kind. Politics, Volume 7 by Aristotle called for a law which mandated the extermination of such unfortunate children. He believed the law was necessary to prevent parents, especially those of the poor and lower classes, from hiding children with deformities during their infancy. Number 7. Both Aristotle and Plato supported state-ordered population control. The philosophy espoused by Aristotle was one of strict government control of population growth. He argued that the state had a responsibility to ensure a balance of resources with the population. Too large a population stressed available resources and led to shortages. Such a situation led to public unrest and the loss of control of the state by the government. Conversely, too small a population led to inadequate production, which had an adverse effect on the economy and trade. It also left the state too weak to defend itself. For Aristotle, government control of birth rates and mortality rates was an essential function. Plato agreed with the need to ensure population growth was controlled to the extent that it did not become a threat to the state. Plato did not agree with Aristotle's arguments, which demanded family size controlled by the state and mandatory abortions. Both of the Greek philosophers agreed that immigration rates and birth rates should be controlled by the state in order to maintain the balance necessary for its security and the overall well-being of the citizenry. The Greek city-states were isolated, restricted in the size of their agricultural lands, and capable of supporting a finite number of people. They adopted laws and social behaviors which allowed them to do so. Number 8. The Golden Age of Greece saw changes in diet due to population growth. What in the late 20th century became known as the Mediterranean diet had its beginnings in Greece during the early 5th century BCE. Pressure from population growth made the available lands for agriculture necessary for greater production of crops for human consumption. Pasturage for cattle and sheep slowly yielded to the growth of grains, fruits, and vegetables. More of the animal protein which fed the people of the city-states began to be taken from the sea. During the preceding Homeric age, the slaughter of cattle was a common feature of Greek literature. By the 5th century, it is all but absent. In the first part of his Republic, Plato addressed the relationship between the population and the state. He postulated the if and when the state met the needs of society as a whole, the people will live pleasantly together, and a prudent fear of poverty or war will keep them from begetting children beyond their means. He then argued that most men would shift their attention to acquiring luxuries, which would require a portion of the population to shift from the production of necessities, but the need for necessities would not be decreased. Plato argued that the result would be unsupportable population growth, which would require more land to support it, which could only be acquired through war. Number 9. Plato believed that population control was a duty of the state. In his Republic, Plato expressed his belief that population growth was a leading cause of war. Since increased population demanded increased territory for its support, he proposed the idea of a ruling class, which he called the guardians. The guardians were to hold both property and mates in common, sharing both among themselves. The guardians were to impose legal restrictions on reproduction within the state, thus achieving and maintaining the balance necessary to ensure harmony. It was Plato's belief that strife between the classes of society and wars of conquest would be eliminated, and all states would achieve their natural state of balance. Plato called the state of balance the realm of temperance, which could only be achieved through the action of the ruling class. He supported the idea of easing pressure caused by overpopulation by creating colonies, with forced emigration of people to them. Plato also advocated the state limiting the number of households allowed within its boundaries. He called overpopulation a circumstance of desperation due to a superabundance of citizens, owing to the mutual affection of those married, and recommended colonization, essentially exile to new states modeled along the lines he suggested in the Republic and subsequent works. Number 10. Plato's focus on population control indicated the problem was severe in ancient Greece. Historical records are sparse regarding the population growth of Athens. Through the 4th century BCE, Athens ruled the smaller towns of Attica, making it the largest and wealthiest of the city-states on the Greek mainland. Eclipsing Sparta, the size of its population at any one time is based largely on speculation, but during the 50 years between repelling the invasion of the Persians, 480 BCE, and the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, 431 BCE, its population more than doubled. By 430 BCE, Athens was densely populated, with over 100 persons per square mile of land. Plato noted that as more and more of the land of Attica was deforested for farming, land was lost to erosion, and the environment was permanently altered. What is left now is like the skeleton of a body wasted by disease, he wrote. The rich soil is carried off, and only the bare framework of the district is left. To Plato, the state was destroying itself through unrestricted population growth. The Peloponnesian War, which was caused in part by overpopulation, led to a new imbalance in Attica caused by the losses of so many young men of the population in battle, and the plague which struck the region on 425 BCE. Number 11. Plato's student Aristotle echoed some of his views on population control. Aristotle was a student of Plato's who agreed with much of what he learned from his teacher, though he also criticized him. Aristotle agreed with the need for the state to regulate the ownership and occupancy of land, but he observed that families which grew beyond the means of the parents to support them regardless of circumstances were inevitably reduced to poverty. To Aristotle, the equitable sharing of land should be accompanied with regulation of the number of children in the family. Aristotle also warned overpopulation led to increased poverty and crime, and thus the state must regulate reproduction rated for its own protection. If no restriction is imposed on the rate of reproduction, and this is the case in most of our existing states, poverty is the inevitable result, and poverty produces in its turn civic dissension and wrongdoing, warned Aristotle. He cited Crete's government segregation of women to prevent them from having too many children as an example of population control. A great state is not the same as a populous state, he warned. Aristotle also believed that excess population was a threat to democratic government, and thus population control was necessary protection in a democratic state. Number 12. Aristotle opposed the practice of abandoning unwanted children as population control. The process of abandoning simply unwanted children was both sanctioned by the state and accepted by the ancient Greeks as moral. It was called exposure. Aristotle opposed exposure as a means of controlling the growth of families. He suggested the law should be changed to prevent the exposure of children to death, merely in order to keep the population down. How widespread the practice of exposure actually was in terms of the numbers of children involved, has never been determined, though some estimates are that 10% of girls were removed from the population through the practice. Aristotle was the first to denounce the practice, and in its stead suggested a law restricting the number of children allowed in a family. It recommended in the event of a pregnancy which would result in a child exceeding the limit, mandatory abortion as early as possible, if children are then conceived in excess of the limit so fixed, to have miscarriage induced before sense, and life have begun in the embryo. He also opined there should certainly be a law to prevent the rearing of deformed children, indicating the philosopher was little concerned with the value of a human being. One of his students was Alexander, whose empire sounded the death knell for the Greek city-states. Number 13. The expansion of empires negated the arguments of Plato and Aristotle. Both Plato and his student Aristotle believed overburdening the state's resources inevitably led to disaster. The state would be forced to engage in international commerce to survive, creating rivalries, or it would be forced to engage in war to obtain additional resources, which brought with them additional population. In either case, continued growth of the population would create additional pressures on resources, and the cycle would continue. The only solution which was compatible with their views on virtue was restricting the size of the population to what existing resources could support. Alexander's conquest made large areas of land available for settlement, and Greeks from the city-states found new regions to occupy. The expansion gave more room for the population to expand into, and it did many abandoning Greece. The lands of the city-states remained concentrated largely in the hands of the rich. Expanding empire replaced the small city-states and ended the argument, for a time, over population control. The Romans later followed a similar model, after first engaging in similar arguments over the population within their lands. Number 14. The Romans practiced population control in reverse. The Romans had no intention of creating relatively small city-states with balanced populations and resources. The Republic and later the Empire were from the onset focused on expansion and growth. Conquering new lands required large armies, as did controlling them while exploiting their resources. The term lex Iulia, Julian laws, refer to laws enacted by any member of the Julian dynasty, but most often are used to refer to a series of laws covering class and marriage enacted by Augustus in 18 and 17 BCE. The laws were intended to both control who married and to whom, and encouraged marriage and children. One of the first of the Augustan-Julian laws enacted in 18 BCE made marriage across class boundaries a crime. The law had the unfortunate effect of contributing to the practice of more wealthy Romans keeping concubines. Augustus enacted the law to encourage morality in marriage, and thus achieved in many cases the opposite. Concubines in ancient Rome, both male and female, were recognized by the state as existing due to the restrictions on marriage based on class status. Most often women of lower classes were kept as concubines, whether the person keeping them was married or not. Number 15. Roman population control laws defended the sanctity of marriage. In 17 BCE, Augustus enacted a law which defended marriage from adultery. Marriage was seen by Roman leaders as essential to the security of the state due to the children it produced, particularly male children. The law specifically targeted the act of adultery and required both parties involved to be banished. They were banished to separate islands, and if they owned property it was for the most part confiscated. There were some exceptions. In the case of spouses with children residing on the property or using it for income, husbands were required by the law to divorce wives convicted of adultery and encouraged to remarry. Husbands who caught their spouse in the act of adultery were allowed to kill the intruder in most cases, and sometimes allowed to kill the offending spouse as well. The fathers of women who committed adultery were allowed to kill them as well, along with their partners. The laws intended to protect marriage were enforced, and adultery was declared to be a public crime. Wives were encouraged to submit to their husbands, the proper role being procreation. Augustus created a law of 3 sons, which elevated the social status of men who fathered 3 or more male children. Number 16. Other Roman population control laws encouraged marriage and children. In 982, Roman suffects, the highest elected post of the government at the time, amended the laws passed by Augustus. Although the law was intended to further encourage and protect marriage, neither of the consuls, Marcus Papius Mutilus and Quintus Pompeius Secundus, were married. The law imposed further restrictions on who could marry whom. For example, senators and their children were forbidden from marrying persons whose parents had been performers, former slaves, or prostitutes. Performers included gladiators, dancers, musicians, and many others. Celibacy was not made strictly illegal past a certain age. but it was strongly discouraged. A celibate could not take possession of an inheritance unless he agreed to marry within a specified period of time, otherwise the inheritance passed to the state. Widows, under the age of 50, would lose what their late husband had left them. If they did not remarry within a specified time, women over 50 and men over 60 were exempt from the law unless they had broken it before attaining those ages. Roman law assumed that a woman was still capable of bearing children up to the age of 50, and thus should be doing so. Number 17. Roman law penalized married couples with no children. Married couples who were unable to have children had their presumed disappointment aggravated by punishment under the law. Husbands between the ages of 25 and 60, and their wives from 20 to 50, were expected to reproduce. The penalties for not doing so were financial. Some couples attempted to adopt, thus having children in their household, but the Senate disregarded adoption as merely an attempt to circumvent the intent behind the law. Conversely, families with several children were awarded with tax advantages, an elevation of status in many cases. The Augustan laws regarding marriage, and the later amendments to them, were enacted in response to falling birth rates. Roman leaders clearly desired large families, increasing the population as the empire continued to expand. Simply put, all eligible men and women were under the law, required to marry or face increased taxation, as well as social disapproval. Once married, they were to produce children. Violating the sanctity of marriage was a serious crime. Eventually, the Augustan laws faded into disuse by the time of Constantine, and most were later formally repealed. Number 18. Prostitution flourished in ancient Rome despite population control laws protecting marriage. Despite the laws which existed promoting marriage and procreation, prostitution by both sexes was legal under Roman law and its proceeds subject to taxation. Another law passed by Augustus decreed that women convicted of adultery could be sentenced to forced prostitution. It remained in effect until late in the 4th century. Prostitutes were not citizens, and thus neither could their offspring be citizens. The practice of birth control thrived in Roman society, even as the leaders of the empire strove to have their citizens bear and raise children. Other women, despite the rewards for bearing children, sought ways to avoid pregnancy. One motivating factor was the high rates of death from postpartum infections or other complications encountered while giving birth. Contraceptives were developed as they were in Greece, using some of the same methods and developing new ones of their own. The expanse of the Roman Empire brought them herbal contraceptives, which had not been available to the Greek city-states, while others were shared by both civilizations. One of them was an herb known as silphium. Number 19. Silphium was a common contraceptive used by the Romans. Silphium came to Rome from Cyrene in North Africa. Cyrenus of Ephesus recommended the use of silphium to induce menstruation. Pennyroyal, as it was in Greece, was used as another contraceptive, especially after supplies of silphium waned. Pennyroyal was highly toxic, causing kidney and liver damage, and if such were observed by Roman doctors, none seem to have written of them. The same was true of other herbal contraceptives. Nearly all of them had undesirable side effects, though not all were toxic to the point of being life-threatening. Some simply caused indigestion or congestion. The common weed found throughout the Western world, known as Daucus carota to botanists and Queen Anne's lace to Americans, was used to initiate miscarriage. It was frequently mixed with other herbs, including pennyroyal, and brewed into a beverage. Other herbs were brewed into beverages by Roman physicians and midwives to do what the authorities no doubt approved of: aid the chance of pregnancy. Others were made to ensure that the child would be a male. The Romans also fashioned intrauterine devices of several different materials, including lead, to prevent unwanted pregnancies. Number 20. The Romans had a modern method of birth control at their disposal. One of the key innovations of the Romans was the development of a robust public health system. It emerged due to the many representatives from the lands they conquered coming to Rome. Citizens traveled to foreign lands and returned. The result was the presence of diseases contracted at various places finding their way around the empire. Among them were sexually transmitted diseases. It is often reported that the Romans had primitive condoms at their disposal. They did, but they were not considered a form of birth control. They were a device used to protect women from sexually transmitted diseases acquired by men. The condoms were made of linen cloth, lined with tissue from the intestines and bladders from sheep and goats. It is often speculated that human tissue was used as well, obtained from men killed in battle. But there is little in the way of evidence to support the claim. They were found in the brothels of Rome and the other cities of the empire. though they were not used for the purpose of contraception, they nonetheless served to support that function, whether the Romans developed them on their own or learned of their use in many of the lands which their armies visited, such as Egypt, is a source of debate.